You're listening to a podcast by Great Kids. To learn more about us, visit our website at greatkidsinc.org.
This is Different Eyes, the view from the heart of another, a Great Kids podcast about overcoming bias in others and in ourselves. We'll be talking about how we can learn to see what others see, and vice versa, helping others see what we see. Our discussions will revolve around bias, cognitive bias and implicit bias, and how this all relates to the work that you do to support families. "2020 has been quite a year. So much has unfolded all around us, impacting each of us in a variety of ways. As we talked about many of these impacts, how they were the same sometimes and other times greatly different, depending on where we were on our journeys, where we've been in our lives, where we are, and where we're going. One day, our conversation evolved into a discussion of cognitive bias and all the ways that this affects decision-making, ours and everyone else's too, without us even realizing it. The conversation got interesting enough that it sparked an idea. That idea gave birth to this podcast. We'll be talking about bias and how that relates to the world of home visiting. It is our hope that by beginning to look through the eyes of others and also helping them to see what we see, we might all start to see things that maybe without each other's help, we never would have seen. Hi, everyone. Welcome. And thanks for joining in on this conversation with us. Shauna Donaldson, the Executive Director of Great Kids, is here with me again today. If you haven't listened in on our previous episodes, we're using this platform for the next few months to talk about cognitive bias and how it relates to our lives and even more specifically to the field of home visiting.
Yeah. Just as a reminder, a cognitive bias is a systematic error in thinking that happens due to these necessary shortcuts that our brains take. Our brains must simplify information so they can be processed quickly. And these become our cognitive biases. That's a mouthful. This feature of the human brain allows us to rapidly make sense of the world and reach decisions in a hurry.
Yeah. So quick thinking is often a lifesaver for us, but using these shortcuts can also lead to some mistakes in our decision making, mistakes that can negatively impact our lives, our relationships, the lives of others, right?
Mm-hmm. And we all have these cognitive biases. We think this conversation is so crucial because we all tend to make the same sort of mistakes in our thinking. And understanding that is an essential first step of preventing this kind of thinking from getting us into problems.
Yeah. So, I've been doing a lot of reading on the topic, and essentially research has identified more than 100 different cognitive biases, but they've grouped them into four basic broad categories. So those categories mean like inaccurate evaluations of either ourselves, inaccurate evaluations of others, not evaluating the risks and the rewards properly, and inaccurately evaluating resources.
Mm-hmm.
So with this series of podcasts, we're working to understand mostly those first two categories of these biases, the inaccurate evaluations of ourselves and of others, because these are usually the ones that can cause the most damage to relationships. So we're hoping that with these conversations, we can begin to see through the eyes of others and understand how they've come to the conclusions that they have about the world.
Yeah. Dana, I love that we are tackling the biases that might negatively impact our relationships.
Right.
Because relationships are at the heart of everything we do at Great Kids. So
Right,
it's
exactly.
It's fun that we're doing these first. So in our first episode, we had a really interesting discussion about confirmation bias.
Yeah.
And in our second podcast, the last one, we talked about the bandwagon effect.
Yeah.
Today, we're going to focus on what's called fundamental attribution error. That one is a mouthful.
Yeah, it is. The name can be a bit overwhelming, but I think as we talk more, everyone will start to be able to recognize this cognitive bias. So fundamental attribution error is defined as when we see someone doing something, particularly something wrong or bad in our interpretation of it, we tend to think that it relates to their personality or their character rather than the situation that the person might be in. The funny thing about this one is that when it comes to us, we actually think in the opposite way.
All right. So let me say this back to you. So what you mean is that when it is us who does something, maybe something wrong, we see it as merely about the situation. It's not a character flaw in us, right?
When it's us, right, yeah.
Right. So these examples are always helpful for understanding these different biases. So what's a simple example for this one?
I'd say an easy place to find an example of this one is in our cars. We judge other drivers a lot, right?
Yeah.
So I remember several years ago, I was driving along a really busy road, multiple lanes of heavy traffic, and I was in a big hurry and feeling particularly impatient. And the car in front of me, we were going along probably 30 miles an hour or so, just all of a sudden came to a complete stop for no apparent reason. The cars in front of it were moving and I had to slam on my brakes, and my immediate reaction was, what a jerk, right? Because they had just slammed on their brakes and of course in my mind for no reason. So my internal thinking was that this was a horrible person who was such a bad driver that they were going to get us all killed, right here on the road. And so I pulled around them, only to realize two things. First, the person driving was actually a very good friend of mine who was not a jerk at all,
Good.
But honestly, one of my favorite people. And secondly, there was a family of ducks trying to cross the road, and that's why she had stopped.
Yeah. So you were attributing her sudden stop to the fact that she was not a reliable person.
Right.
But really, it wasn't about her at all. It was just the situation that she found herself in.
Yeah, yep. It was the duck family. Everyone managed to get stopped in time, and the ducks made it safely to the other side of the road, by the way.
Excellent. Good news. We're happy all the ducks survived. So in this example, you were able to pretty quickly identify your mistake in judgment or your mistake in thinking. But oftentimes, we don't get to know the other person's situation. So we just go on believing that their actions, particularly their bad actions or the ones we don't care for, are about who they are and not about a situation they may be in.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. The fundamental attribution error exists because of how people perceive the world around them. While we always have a pretty good idea about our own character and our motivations and the situations that affect our day-to-day, we rarely really get that glimpse inside, and so we don't know everything that's going on with someone else. So this connects to what we said earlier about how when it's other people's behavior, we judge it as a character flaw, but when it's something we've done wrong, we attribute it to the situation.
Yeah, and that makes a lot of sense. Because when we know what our situations are, but we don't know theirs.
Right, exactly. So to explore this a bit further, let's take an example from the world of parenting or home visiting that we could unpack a little bit and see how this might relate to the fundamental attribution error.
Mm-hmm. We often assume things about the families that we're working with, right? And it's those assumptions that get us into trouble sometimes. So for one example that we can talk about, let's say that we have maybe a mom who's in recovery from substance use disorder.
Yeah.
everything's going well, great visits, great engagement, beautiful parent-child interaction. And then suddenly it isn't.
Right.
And maybe what we notice first is that mom seems distracted.
Mhm.
She's leaving the room constantly when you're there. You see her checking her phone. You notice that the baby hasn't had a diaper change. And even mom's general appearance, like she's not fixed her hair. All of those things that you're seeing are not typical for those experiences that you've had with that parent. You also notice maybe the dishes are unwashed. They're kind of stacked in the sink. Items are strewn about the floor, which is, again, unusual for this family. And you notice this over a couple of visits, and then you go for another one, and then they're not home.
Right.
And the neighbor sees you outside and says, they've been gone for a couple of days. So as the home visitor, what might you be thinking at this point?
Well, I think if I'm being honest, so I want to think I would be thinking the best, but if I'm being honest, my gut reaction might be taking me to the conclusion that maybe mom's using again. I'm worried for mom, but I'm also really worried for the baby. And I might even start to get a little angry at mom, thinking to myself that she's put the baby at risk, for some reason.
Yeah. And that's what happens. Our thoughts, our first thoughts might go to something like that, right? We are attributing all the things that we're seeing as signs of something happening in mom, right? We know that she has struggled in the past with substance use disorder. So that's where we go the quickest, right? Maybe we think that, again, she's struggling. So you can start to see where I'm going with this, right? We attribute what we know about her historical experience
Right.
to what's going on with her right now.
Yeah, so I do think I see where you're going, and I'm hoping that there's a plot twist here that shows me how wrong I was to let this fundamental attribution error cause me to miscalculate.
Yeah, yeah. Um, in this particular situation, you were right. There was a mistake in our thinking. Um, we did try to continue to reach out to this parent for several months and was not able to locate her. And then just when we're ready to close, right, we hear from her. Mom calls. And she shared that her own mother had been diagnosed with a very serious illness. Her mother lived out of state, and that she had made the decision to go and be with her and to help out and be a support. She said that she was really struggling trying to make that decision because she had good support locally where she was, but just being close to her mom was really important. So her and the baby packed up and went. And she plans on staying there now. She's living with her folks. She's helping with her mom's medical care. She's even able to have a part-time job because she has extra support from other family in the community. And things are okay for her. And there was no substance use at all.
Right, right. So my gut reaction did not serve me well, and that's the problem with cognitive bias is that it leads us to these really quick assessments of the world, but often those assessments are just wrong. I think the real question becomes how do we keep from letting those kinds of errors impact our future thinking?
Right.
So we all know we've done it in the past, but what can we do about it? How can we start to maybe minimize those
Mhm.
situations?
And I think that's probably the most challenging part of all these discussions that we're having about our different types of biases that we have. And it's just as we've been saying all along, the first thing we have to do is just know that it exists.
Right,
Then once we know that we do have a bias, then we can start to get intentional about overcoming them.
right, right. Yeah. So always the first step, right, is understanding the reality of how our brain works and what might be going on with us. I think one of the critical things to remember is that these are the default in our brain. This is the brain's go-to way, right, of processing information. So we can't completely prevent ourselves from making errors in our thinking, or even in this case specifically, these attribution errors. We can, I think, however, learn to override those automatic thoughts and find our way to some better decisions. So the research on this is called debiasing research, right? And the research on debiasing our cognitive biases shows us that simply learning about these blind spots isn't quite enough. That changing this way of thinking is really hard, and it requires a lot of intentional work on our parts. Like really being deliberate about the way we think about things.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk a little bit more about what that might look like. And I loved your example that you shared earlier, that your gut instinct or your go-to, right? It didn't serve you well.
Yeah.
So now we're talking about being intentional. So it's almost like we're saying there's these two very different things going on in our head. It's gut instinct, our go-to, but nope, be intentional, slow it down.
Yeah. And I think that's a great way to think about it, Shauna. I'd say there are actually two systems that we can use when we're making decisions. First, we have that automatic system in our brain that just allows us to think things without ever even being aware that it's happening, right? That gut instinct I mentioned, that part of the brain. This is good sometimes, right? Because there are so many things to think about in our world that we'd be exhausted if we had to be conscious of every little decision. It would be too much. So experts say that this system within our brain is kind of like an elephant in that it's the most powerful of the two systems. It's the go-to for the brain. It's our habits and our intuitions that take over when we're on autopilot, so to speak. But our elephant also has a rider, right? And that rider is the second system, or that intentional system within our brain. And that system can actually guide our elephant to go in the direction that's more in line with our goals. So this is the system that we've got to engage in a bigger way, that intentional system. So we've got to keep the rider in charge, not the elephant, if we want to avoid that impact that attribution error can have on our work, our relationships, our lives, really.
Mm-hmm. So I'm thinking that to engage the rider or that intentional system, we need to start by delaying our decisions or our reactions just a bit, right? Because the elephant springs into action in milliseconds.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, this intentional system or the rider takes a little bit longer to get activated or engaged. So it's kind of like the idea of counting to 10 when you're angry, right? Yeah. That's what allows your rider to get back in control of the elephant.
Yeah. And, that's such a simple thing. And we've all probably heard it from the time we were young, right? But it's a great strategy, really, because it gives us the time and space to calm down and make a more reasoned response to a situation. I think I'd also suggest thinking about those kinds of situations where the elephant might get worked up, and thinking about them in advance and coming up with a policy that could guide your future self, right? So thinking about it when you're calm. So if you can come up with how you're going to handle those kinds of situations when you're calm, then you can just follow your own rule when you're not so calm. So I know someone who can get pretty triggered by comments people are making on the internet. She hated that she would just get on a rant when she read something that she majorly disagreed with. So she came up with a policy for herself. And every time she finds herself in one of these rants about someone, she makes herself stop and think of 3 things that she has in common with the person. And it really works for her.
Yeah. And I think that's genius, right? It not only slows her down, but it also puts her in a place of empathy for that person.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? Thinking about their experiences. Yeah. If we stay focused on our differences, it is easy to stay in that automatic part of our brain. But when you think about them as a person who is like us in so many ways, that allows the elephant rider to see through the eyes of the other person.
Right, right. And it seems that it's all really then about slowing down, right? Giving each other the benefit of the doubt in very intentional ways, and shifting our thought patterns from judgment to curiosity. Instead of thinking poorly of someone when they behave in a way that we don't like, we might instead wonder about the circumstances that maybe cause them to act that way. Empathy. I've noticed it comes down to empathy when we talk about, we always sort of circle back to this when we talk about overcoming these cognitive biases.
Yeah. You're exactly right. The ability to see through the eyes and a heart of another gets us to a place where everyone is valued for who they truly are.
Yeah. I think maybe that's an excellent place to wrap this one up, Shauna.
Yeah.
We'll be back again in 2 weeks to wrestle with yet another of the common cognitive biases, and we'll be exploring how it impacts our lives and our work and what we might do about it.
Yeah. Thanks. And we look forward to being with you guys next time.
Bye.